Let's plan a romantic dress. To help with that, I'll be using Millinote. I have photos of the fashion fabric I want to use and what it looks like layered. I added a simple description, a list of materials, and starting steps. Side note, this isn't a sponsored ad for Millinote, I just use it occasionally. I decided to use a store-bought pattern this time for the bodice. I chose the sweetheart neckline with a lace overlay. I had this beautiful rose lace and needed something underneath. I didn't have a similarly colored solid fabric, then I remembered I had this black satin. Together, they gave a mysteriously elegant look. After breaking the paper out of the envelope, I searched for the bodice pattern pieces. To get some wrinkles out, I ironed the pattern paper on a low setting. Because I needed to test out the fit, I used tracing paper to help draft. I've not used a commercial pattern in probably a decade, but they were on a 50-cent clearance. I didn't alter anything in the first draft, even though I knew the bust would be too big. To make my mock-ups, I used some biodegradable yard fabric. It doesn't drape like regular fabric, but it does help give an idea of the fit. Even though it's a fitted bodice, they still put way too much ease room in the garment in comparison to the body measurements given. I went down a size for the bust, and now it fits just fine. I did add just a tad to the waist for the final update. Here I have a basic black cotton and a lining fabric. As the satin needs more structure, I'm using the cotton underneath. This set of cotton pieces will also be used as a pattern since it will shift less than tracing paper. With the base, satin, and lining layers cut out, it's time to assemble a bit. I machine basted along the edges of each of the base and satin layers to create singular pieces. The pattern called for a 5/8 seam allowance, so I went with a 1/2 inch so that it can move with the curves better but not show the stitches. Now the bodice pieces are all prepped. Time to go ahead and sew the lining together. To go around the bust curve, I have the straight edge on top and I'm very carefully aligning the two together as I get to the needle. I intentionally did not pin it to give me better control. With the lining done, I went back to test out the overlay pattern. I aligned the size differences on the top and bottom parts with what I did for the bodice. Even though I knew I'll need to adjust the neckline, I kept it to see how far I might need to alter it. I'm not a fan of the wide shoulder design personally, so I opted for a more traditional curved necklines with shoulders sitting normally. With the shoulders brought in 1/2 inch and the neckline brought down, I went ahead and cut out the lace pieces. I didn't want to make a second hole mock-up for this one, so hopefully it'll be fine. The pattern had a prominent dart for the bust, so I'm guessing it's built for a non-stretch organza or like. With the lace being stretchy, it probably wasn't as necessary, but I still kept the dart as the original pattern. Now back to the black bodice to assemble it. It was a nervous process, but I was able to create a smooth curve. I sewed each piece from top to bottom, mirroring directions so the seams lie the same. I decided to use the seam allowance to create the boning channels by sewing along the very edge. The instructions said to create a separate casing, but my boning was narrow enough to fit. Afterwards, I realized the instructions had the channels on the lining, but no matter as it will all be covered by the lace. For the flat sections, I used thick zip ties. And for the bust, I had just a tiny bit of plastic boning left over from a corset. Before adding the boning, I sewed the bodice and lining pieces together along the top. Then I understitched the seam allowance along the lining to help keep it flat. After giving it one more press on the iron, I broke out some horsehair braid. I added it along the top seam on the inside to give the neckline a crisp look. I recommend using an old needle when sewing the plastic. With the boning in, I stitched it at the bottom to keep it above the seam allowance. Jumping back to the lace overlay, I started with sewing the darts. I made sure to hand tie the points and baste the dart end. Then I continued to sew the sides together. The bodice is coming together and I can finally see the vision taking shape. As this lace fabric doesn't fray, I don't have to worry about finishing the seams. To prevent the neckline and armholes from stretching though, I ran a basting stitch around the edges. This also creates a guide for when I'm finishing them. After sewing the shoulders, I prepared the custom bias strips. These were 2 inches wide and I cut them to fit along the arm and neck holes. After pressing them a half, I originally sewed the arm bias strips in a loop. They ended up being a bit long, so I just sewed as normal and overlapped the edges a bit. After trimming it very close to the edge, I folded the extra bit over at the raw edge and sewed it again. I did the same to the neckline. Now that the bodice is done enough, time for the skirt. I had waited this long to draft a pattern as I was still debating on the length of the skirt. I decided on a length just past the knees, which was the longest that would fit in the fabric. These 6 panels, one being the split for the zipper, were cut on the lining, then the satin, and finally the lace. Each fabric type becoming a pattern for the next. This was so tedious and kind of rushed with the delusions of actually finishing in time for Valentine's Day. Somehow I was able to line up the lace to basically fit on the pattern repeat. For the back panel, I added a seam allowance to the straight edge. With all 18 pieces done, I went and basted the lace to the satin. I did find keeping a small container level with the machine made basting easier. Taking the extra time to baste the lace on helped make sewing everything together easier. The rose patterns were mirrored and directional when I cut the lace out, but it wasn't too noticeable. I also didn't want to waste a lot of fabric. With everything basted, I sewed the skirt pieces up until 6 inches from the hem. I sewed the lining the full length. I was able to have the lace pattern lined up to mirror each other, so it blended nicely. To make the lace valances, I hand gathered the lace onto a 1-inch space. Then I tacked them down and finished sewing it. This was the day before Valentine's Day when I still had false hopes that I would finish in time. The sun was now setting, and at this point I reconciled that I wouldn't be able to make it. So I took that opportunity to hang my skirt like you're supposed to. It didn't stretch like I expected it to, but that's okay. After pinning the lining to the skirt, I started the boring process of sewing the hem. Halfway through, I decided not to bother continuing to pin, but then took it off the machine to pin the rest. Counterintuitively, I pressed apart the hem with an iron before understitching. This heightens the crispness of the hem. Then I made the decision to add horsehair braid to the edge. I wanted the hem to stand out to show off the valance design. I made sure to sew it underneath the seam allowance and to the lining. After holding up the skirt to myself, I realized that the braid does not hold up the hem quite well enough. I did have just enough to add another round a few inches above. That did help somewhat, along with hand tacking points along the skirt. Before sewing the back of the skirt, I realized I needed the lace panels sewn together first. So marking where the zipper ends, I continued with sewing the layers separately. With the loose braid ends, I overlapped them slightly when finishing. Now that everything is prepped, I sewed the top of the skirt in the lining. Back to the bodice. To keep the satin bodice from shifting and dropping down, I hand sewed the lace overlay along the neckline and hem. Before that, I hand tacked the lining along the top half of the seam and neckline. Tips on getting the stapler out of the zipper: use a seam ripper. For this invisible zipper, I heard you should iron the teeth open as much as possible. I decided to sew the back up to help line up the zipper. Before adding the zipper, I did need to sew the skirt to the bodice. As the skirt was a little bigger than the bodice, I hand gathered and pinned before sewing. I did flip it over and sew twice, the second time following along the guideline I added along to the bodice. Although I used an invisible zipper foot with the invisible zipper, I wasn't installing it correctly. The thread kept catching the teeth and I spent hours of seam ripping and then hand sewing it. Close to midnight that day, I realized I could have just used a regular zipper foot. It took less than 15 minutes to finish installing it. It's a bit of a hot mess, but it zips up and the teeth don't show. To finish the lining, I pressed the seam allowance in before hand sewing. That made it much quicker, and at this point, another week had passed and I couldn't be bothered to sew a fancy slip-in stitch. As this bodice is not a snatched corset closure, I wanted something stronger than the lace overlay to hold up the weight of the dress. I salvaged some invisible straps off a jacket, and since it wasn't quite long enough, I added some nude color ribbon at the ends. After testing out the precise fit, I hand sewed the straps in. Somewhere along the line, I added a hook and eye at the back of the neck. I almost forgot that I now have my own custom clothing labels, so I carefully added one to the back. After much work, I finally completed this dress. Surprisingly to me, it turned out to be how I envisioned it originally. I really loved how the lace looked over the smooth satin, as well as the gathers at the bottom showing it off. It was different using a commercial pattern, but I suppose it helped quicken the process. I already know what my next project is, so hopefully I'll get it done in time. Let me know in the comments what projects you're working on, whether it be sewing or otherwise.